Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's so wonderful to have you all here with us today. I'm Lizzie Meister with the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. I'm the public programs manager here in New Orleans, Louisiana, but we're thrilled to be able to broadcast this program around the world about
Those
flames of
screams and
freedom.
just
So
how
we ask that
terrifying the screams are
everybody
there. In a
stay
moment,
on
we're going to speak to
mute, and we will
the
get
heater, saw the gunman.
Okay, let's get started. So, let me really get started with the little Zoom stuff that we don't want to forget. So we asked everybody to stay on mute. Please ask your questions throughout this conversation with Richard Stone and Mark Simon, producers of Flames of Freedom, in the chat. And at the end, we will be asking those questions. So ask them throughout. A recording of today's presentation will be made available, and so you'll be able to share it far and wide with your community. Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers today. The first speaker I want to introduce is the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience's own Michael Jacobs. He is our curator, and he will be in conversation with Mark and Richard. Michael is a Virginia native who earned a BA in History and Museum Studies from the University of Pittsburgh in 2018 and an MA in Public History from American University in 2022. Before joining the team at MSJE, he held positions at the Marine Corps University Archives and Gunston Hall in Mason Neck, Virginia, among other archives and museums. In July 2023, he became the curator of collections of exhibits at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, and Michael will be moderating today's conversation. And then I want to introduce Richard Stone, writer and creative director of Flames of Freedom. Richard has been a fiction writer and nonfiction writer for the past 40 years. Books and other writing include Story Intelligence, co-written with Scott Livingood, The Healing Art of Storytelling, Stories, The Family Legacy, The Kingdom of Nat, On the Spot, a feature-length romantic comedy co-written with Sid and Enid Jackowitz, Sprinkles, a sitcom co-written with Sid and Enid Jackowitz, The Magid, a feature-length film, which Rick has also developed into a one-man performance, piece, and 2 children's books, which are awaiting publication. It Can Be Almost Anything and The Fairy Tale Factory. And Mark Simon has served in the motion picture industry for 4 decades. His most recent endeavor include co-authoring the first 4 hours of a historical drama television series, Flames of Freedom, with lead writer Richard Stone, and season 1 of the now streaming podcast adaptation of the podcast. Is it a television series podcast? I think that's a good question that we'll have to ask, and how it got developed. He's the lead producer of the independent film The Odyssey by Bobby Summers, slated to go into production in later part of 2025. Additionally, he's working on co-creating a feature comedy based on the real-life story of 3 brothers who produced arguably some of the most iconic and worst B-list films in the motion picture industry in the 1950s and 60s. After living and working in LA in the 80s and 90s, he relocated to Atlanta to pursue a quality of life for his wife and 2 children following the devastating Northridge earthquake in '94. After a brief stint in Chicago, where he is a native of, he moved to Atlanta in '96, while his career in motion picture production remained deeply rooted in Chicago and Hollywood mainstream of feature films, television, and national television commercials. Mark founded an Atlanta-based production company, Fizz City Films, in 1998, and has since produced, shot, and directed thousands of TV commercials and radio spots over the last 20 years. He's a skilled producer and director of photography, and his most recent short independent films are Blind Trust and Let's Make It. Mark's career has been endured over 30 feature films and dozens of television shows that have stripped the American landscape: Spinal Tap, Risky Business, Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Dick Tracy, In the Line of Fire, and 30-something. Before he embarked on his track as a producer, he was represented by commercial production companies as a director DP in Toronto, Fort Lauderdale, Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, and Miami for Latin America. In the early 90s, he served as an associate professor of cinematography at the prestigious Art Center of College of Design in Pasadena. Without further ado, I will let these 3 gentlemen talk about this really fascinating podcast, Flames of Freedom.
Thank you so much, Lizzie, for that lovely introduction. Richard, Mark, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I think a great place for us to begin is what Lizzie kind of alluded to earlier on, is how did this project begin? How long has it been in development? Can you kind of tell us how this all started out?
Why don't you field that, Mark? Because it starts with you,
All
sort of.
right. Well, it started with a gentleman named Lance Toland, who is a resident of the Savannah area. He's actually on an island adjacent to Sea Island, adjacent to Savannah, Georgia. He's a member of Mikveh Israel, which is the third oldest temple in the United States. Some of you probably are aware of that. And actually, he had a relationship or has a relationship with a former Rabbi Sal Rubin, who wrote a book called Third to None, alluding to the fact that the importance of the establishment of Mikveh Israel, which is a Reformed Sephardic temple, and it goes back to the beginning of our story. Well, the beginning of our story as it becomes part of Georgia history. Lance, this became a passion of Lance's, the whole story, and he stumbled upon what looks like a headstone at the intersection, main intersection in Savannah, Bull and Oglethorpe streets. It's a large granite block, and lo and behold, it says James Oglethorpe on it, and below it is a six-stem or seven-stem menorah. And he stopped and he looked at it and he contemplated, what the heck does James Oglethorpe have to do with the Jews? So he began researching about it, and there's a story about how there was a tour group there when he arrived, and there were pebbles on top of the memorial. It's actually a memorial. You go around to the backside of it, and it lists many of the original settlers that are believed to be interned there. Now that on the subject of historical accuracy, we know for a fact that it's highly unlikely that some of the names that are listed there are actually buried at that location. But it was the original burial ground for the Jews that arrived in Savannah in July of 1733. So, Rick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, so that was the beginning of a journey for Lance, and this started back in the '80s. So this is a long journey, and at some point he got interested in actually doing a documentary about those first Jews who arrived, and shot a lot of footage. Even had like a drone flying through Mikveh Israel synagogue, which is quite some really remarkable footage. And if you haven't had a chance to see that synagogue, it's well worth seeing it because it looks like something out of Europe. It doesn't look like anything you will have ever associated architecturally with a synagogue. And went to Beavis Marks Synagogue, which is the Sephardic synagogue in London, and interviewed the rabbi there, which is also part as a has a place in our story. And at some point, we've got somebody who's not on mute, Ellen Kessler. Yeah, thank you, Ellen. And so at some point, he started trying to put this together, and then COVID happened and the pandemic, and it kind of shut the whole project down. And he decided to resurrect it back about 3 years ago, something like that, I guess. And Mark has a colleague and a friend who's in the entertainment law business who was introduced to Lance. And Lance said, do you know anybody that can help me with this project? And went to Mark. Mark came to me, and we began working. And it was a arduous process because there was a lot to learn, huge amounts of research that was done. And before we could even begin to write one word or one, we had to really understand what was the story, and that was quite a journey in itself.
Could you kind of I think that's a great place for actually us to continue with. Can you talk about some of the biggest challenges in translating this 18th century history into a modern and compelling docudrama?
Um, you want to take a shot at that, Mark, and then you can.
Well, let me tell you or describe how it went through various stages of development. Yeah, Lance, of course, he had produced executive produced a documentary about wartime and shipbuilding in in an area by Sea Island that was kind of an untold story that was important. So he had documentary on the mind. So, the real difference between a documentary and what we accomplished is that, a documentary takes historical facts and does that. It documents them. There isn't necessarily a story that goes along with it. It's just reporting of factual events in history. And one thing we immediately found, Rick and I, spent at least six solid months rolling up our sleeves and digging into archives, starting in Savannah at the Historical Society, Georgia Historical Society, and then we did a lot of online research, going back to, back to the Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, and we learned more and more about our key character, who is Dr. Diogo Nunez Ribeiro. And one of the difficulties in this process that we came across right away was the fact that not only did they have the Portuguese names, which are a lot more complicated than our conventional, surnames, with taking on the mother's surname and the father's surname. It's different between the son and the daughter. And also within the Sephardic tradition, the Ashkenazi Jews, as most of you know, name children after the deceased to honor the deceased who lived before them. Well, in the Sephardic tradition, they name children traditionally after themselves. So they don't follow the same rules. So you could have someone or several people with the same names, and tracking them historically, you have to make sure you have the right person, based on, various facts and birth dates and marriages and births and so forth. So we started out with the idea of the documentary. We found huge gaps in time. One of the key resources we started with was Rabbi Rubin's book. Had a lot of the cold hard facts as he knew them, and in a lion's share of those facts were adopted from a journal that was kept, and they're not sure whether the journal was done as a job or just sort of as taken on by Benjamin Sheftel, as something he felt he needed to do to report the history. And we were talking to Michael just the other day, and I mentioned that the original journal, Benjamin Sheftel was Ashkenazi. He came from what is essentially Frankfurt, Germany, back when it was still part of the part of Prussia. And he left due to a pogrom that had happened in Frankfurt at the time. He and his wife left. Most of the characters in our story revolve around, it started out with 42 Sephardic Jews, most of whom were related to a particular doctor, Dr. Samuel Nunez, who is the pivotal, character in this story. And he's very real. He existed. We went back actually to the archives of the notaries from the Portuguese Inquisition, to the exact inquisitor and the exact notary who documented the trial essentially of Diogo Nunez Dr. Diogo Nunez, his wife at the time, who went by
Gracia.
Gracia, and his father. And this was in 1703. And these records we found in the archive in Lisbon, Portugal. We also found that they tracked to a library in Israel at one of the universities. And the Catholics, the papacy, also have archives of the records from the Inquisition. So it was the first time that we really could substantiate the names that we had associated with in the rabbi's book and other stories that were told to the actual family. Now, the one thing that was typical of this particular family was the fact that they were conversos. For those who may not know what a converso is, it was a period of time, or several periods of time through the course of hundreds of years, where Jews were forced into Catholic baptisms and conversions. So it was either conversion, fleeing the country, or being imprisoned, or being burned at the stake. If they totally defied the order to convert, they were typically tortured and burned at the stake. Those that conformed, some of them adapted Catholicism, and that was it. They kind of left any Jewish tradition behind to spare their lives more than anything. Now, there were some that kept the spark and practiced Judaism, or what they knew of Judaism, in practice in secrecy. So they'd publicly, go to church, have prayers, have Christian names, and we discovered that they were in our story, even though it starts in 1703 or 1700. There were 7 or 8 generations in to being conversos. So there were, 6, 7, 8 families before them that were forced into Catholicism. So,
And there's some really interesting, pause for a second, if you would, Mark. There's some really interesting little things with that. For example, in their hiding, they found ways to subvert the Catholics. They would hide a mezuzah inside a statue of Mother Mary that would be by the door, and they would reach down and kiss the statue. So they were able to keep some semblances of Judaism alive, but they also did not have Hebrew prayer books. There were no synagogues in Portugal anymore. So they were far, far removed from a lot of the liturgy that you and I are familiar with. And they were only familiar with certain holidays, really. Hanukkah was a big holiday. Um, and Passover, obviously. And so there were certain kinds of things that they were able to stay in touch with, but most of the prayers were in Spanish, which was the religious kind of language for them, whereas Portuguese was the everyday language. So,
and we learned, we had several conversations with world experts, some of whom we interviewed on a separate track of our podcast program. We had the historical drama, historically based drama, and we also had interviews with experts. And one of the gentlemen who is one of the foremost experts on Sephardic Judaism is a professor of history, of Jewish history and literature at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And he's relatively young. He's probably in his 50s. Extremely well educated. He studied in the United States at Stanford. I think he speaks 9 or 10 languages, and he coincidentally is also a rabbi. and still practiced as a rabbi to a very select community in the Balkans. So he's an unusual character, and he knows he's just a wealth, a fountain of knowledge in terms of this part of history and what actually is believed to have occurred. And one of the things that he said is that even the Jews of the time, because very few knew Hebrew, they didn't have the same rabbinical kinds of studies or aspects to Judaism because it was forbidden. So they only knew a few traditions. They lit candles on Friday night. They knew certain prayers. They knew a little bit of Hebrew. They knew a little bit about the holidays and traditions. And some of the traditions they learned only because they were forbidden. So they actually learned the traditions from the Catholics just because the Catholics told them this is what they weren't supposed to do or weren't allowed to do. So
there's one pivotal event historically also here is that everyone's familiar with the year 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But it was also the year the Jews were expelled from Spain, which was a really cataclysmic event because Spain was the center of Jewish life in the Western world at that point. So in many ways, it was comparable to the Babylonian exile.
yeah.
Many Jews went eastward toward Turkey and other parts around the Mediterranean. Many went to Portugal, where they were welcomed because the king of Portugal was happy to have them with their wealth and their knowledge. And but 5 years later, in 1497, the king of Portugal wanted his son to marry the daughter of Isabel and Ferdinand, and they had one condition: that there be no Jews left in Portugal. And so he put out the word that all the Jews who would want to leave, he would make arrange for free passage from Lisbon if they came to Lisbon. And of course, he lied. And when they arrived, they were all basically separated from their children, and they were sequestered in a square, 30,000 Jews, and told, if you ever want to see your children again, and if you want to live, then you have to accept Catholicism. So there's mass conversion of thousands of Jews in one day. Uh, and many of those were, and Diogo Nunes can trace his lineage all the way back to that event. So it's a rich and also painful history in many respects.
I think one of the
I'm sorry, go ahead, Michael.
I think earlier we met one of the things that you mentioned with the struggle was the fact with the name changes, the fact that sometimes when they use their Hebrew names later on, or their Catholic or Portuguese names, and that was I imagine a struggle to kind of track down individuals over time because of that. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're able to do that?
Sure. The particular family, the Nunez family, and some of their close relatives, they had Christian names living in most of our primary characters were from Lisbon or lived in Lisbon, and that they had hyphenated last names. So it was like Dr. Nunez Ribeiro, and his wife was. She went by Gracia, but her name was Maria Catena de Lucena. And of course, it gets very confusing, like who the kids are and this and that. And of course, they were fortunate enough to escape the family, the Dr. Nunez's family, and some of the close relatives, sister-in-law, Gracia's sister, and her husband, and their daughters, and their sons, and some of the other relatives. When they went to London, that's where they met up with some Ashkenazi Jews, and the interesting thing there is that the Ashkenazi Jews that they had direct contact with were actually members of Bevis Marks, And what appeared to have happened historically, there was a Sephardic temple a mile away or less than a mile away,
Ashkenazi temple
an
synagogue.
Ashkenazi synagogue, yeah. So they never made it there. They were either directed to the wrong temple, or they got there and they kind of felt somewhat at home, even though culturally it was different than what they were accustomed to, or they didn't have the means, or they had language barriers that didn't allow them to, question where they were at the time. So that's that. So one of the shocks to the Sephardic Jews, going from the culture of being conversos, and there's also another term. There were actually crypto Jews, were conversos who practiced Judaism, that practiced in secrecy. So when they got to Beavis Marks and they wanted to explore their religious freedom as Jews, to learn what it meant to be a Jew, they found out that it wasn't a very easy course at all. That in addition to learning Hebrew and learning the traditions and the learning that there was oral law and Talmudic law, and the adult men, or all the men, even the adult men, had to be circumcised to be fully embraced into Judaism. These were pretty extreme to what they had known. And, in some ways they were more comfortable with the Catholicism that they had learned or were forced into, in spite of the fact that here was an opportunity to, worship freely as Jews. To become a Jew in an absolute sense was a huge commitment. Well, in doing so, the men were circumcised. The marital vows in many cases were redone as Jewish vows, and they all adapted Hebrew names. So now they have the Christian names. They're in a new culture where, even with their Christian names, they shortened them. Like Dr. Nunez Ribeiro was now Dr. Nunez. And then Diogo took on the name Shemuel. So now he's got a Hebrew name. So now we had to track him, in the history books as Dr. Samuel Nunez. Well, Nunez, a lot of the Portuguese names also end in ES or EZ. And you see, if you know anybody with a name like Mendes or Nunez or Mendoza, or a lot of the names that just end in EZ or ES, you see it both ways. Well, sometimes they flipped it deliberately so it would be more confusing if the Inquisition, if the Spaniards were trying to track them down, that it would be more difficult to find out who was who. So they deliberately, or they changed their name completely. So there's all of that, and through that mess, we did the best we could in terms of following their trails and following what we could in the history records, temple records, death records, grave markers, and in many ways, tracking through the church or the synagogue records was the best way to, be able to track a family. It is, if you're a genealogist, that's typically, one of the many pathways.
Yeah. There were also some really interesting challenges as well, because in many cases there was no historical record. There were big, gigantic holes and gaps in the record. And so, for example, we know that Dr. Nunez and his wife, Gracia, were released by the Inquisition in 1705, 1706, somewhere around there. and we lose touch with them. And suddenly by 1726, and what we also know is when the Inquisition, if you were arrested by the Inquisition, it was really their license to, excuse me, confiscate all of your belongings, all of your property. And so when they were released in 1706, they had to start all over again. And we know by 1726, their fortunes had turned. And by then, Dr. Nunez was the physician to the Inquisitor General, which is a remarkable kind of turn of events, and was also, we believe, the physician to the King of Portugal and many people in the royal court. So his social status had completely gone into a whole different direction, and partly probably because he was a gifted physician, a gifted diagnostician, and so but we had this big gap. What happened in those 20 years? And by doing this as a dramatic historical drama, it allowed us to fill that gap. We had to use our imagination to imagine what were the kinds of things that logically could have happened or would have happened that would have allowed that to happen and occur. Because they were rearrested in 1726. We have documentation for that. And partly because Dr. Nunez had apparently been assisting other conversos to escape on mail ships to go to England. And so, but they had laid low and been very careful for 20 years until new accusations, emerged. And in those days, anyone could accuse anyone, and they could do it anonymously. And so I could accuse you, Michael, of being a converso. You would never get a chance to defend your name or have me cross-examined. And in this situation, you were guilty until proven innocent. And how did you prove your innocence? Well,
Guilty by accusation.
yeah, yeah. And so under torture, most people would say, okay, I did it. Okay. And in most cases, people had their hands slapped, they had their properties confiscated. Those who refused to confess were the ones who often were, heretical and were often burned at the stake. So,
Or severely tortured and
yeah,
imprisoned.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Richard, you actually are helping me with a great segue into my next question, which is how did you balance historical accuracy with this dramatic storytelling and writing the script? Did you ever need to fictionalize certain events or characters to fill those gaps, particularly kind of going back to the Inquisition general and his relationship with Dr. Nunez and that specific conversation?
You as a historian understand this very well, these issues of accuracy. And so we did everything we could to be as truthful as we could to the facts as we knew them. But this case in point of this relationship, for example, for over 20 years, that had to have evolved with the Inquisitor General. And when we first started, this project actually started out as a TV project. And we actually wrote a 2.5 hour screenplay that would be that might have then segued into a series. And when we got done with that, we had a live read with actors. And Mark and I looked at each other and we said, there's some real problems with this script, which is often the case in the first kind of draft of a script. And one of the problems was the relationship with the Inquisitor General, which we basically just sort of kind of glossed over. We knew he had the relationship, and we felt that had to be developed dramatically. Um, and so there were creative choices that we made as we went about writing that and going and recreating what would have logically have happened. So we imagined one day that Diogo Nunes receives a letter demanding his appearance, at the palace, where also which was also a prison to meet with the Inquisitor General, and he's thinking probably the jig is up. I'm going to be accused again, and with great trepidation he goes there, and what does he discover? Is that the Inquisitor General has a medical problem that his doctor has not been able to help him with, and he hears that Diogo Nunes is a very gifted diagnostician, and could he help him? And so suddenly the roles are reversed, and there is Diogo Nunes examining the Inquisitor General. And and actually accurately diagnoses a problem that no one else had been able to figure out, which was acid reflux. But which could obviously show up as something respiratory, which all the other physicians were missing, and was able to actually guide him and developed a very close relationship with him, which actually helped him develop intelligence about what was happening and who was getting arrested, and often gave him a chance to warn those people to get out. So we made that up. Uh, but you know, history. We think that history is factual, but history is filled with with interpretations. You, as an historian, come to the historical facts with a point of view, a perspective, and what those facts mean, and so we did our best to look at that. But there is nothing in the history book that could actually tell us what happened when Diogo Nunes engineered his escape. We know factually through correspondence or a letter that actually his daughter Zipporah wrote many years later, describing the events that occurred, that he engineered their escape on an English uh, ship. Um, how that came about, we didn't know anything about that. So we had to kind of imagine what would have happened that would have positioned him to do that. And we do know that the Inquisitor General stationed two priests, inquisitors, to live at his house once he had been arrested the second time. He was too valuable an asset to be put in jail. And he politically was too well positioned to be kind of put into that kind of position. Inquisitor General needed him, but he wanted to keep an eye on him. And so they were basically caged. And it was clear that that was not tenable any longer. They had to find a way out of that. And so that became uh, what I think turned out to be a well-written episode that felt very believable. And so we don't know what he said to the captain of the English ship, but we had to imagine what was done to engineer that escape and actually to basically co-opt the two priests who were living in the house into the scheme without them knowing it.
Another tricky thing that we had encountered was who's telling the story. With a documentary, you can have a narrator, and basically talking about the history and so forth. Well, we needed someone telling our story. We needed a voice. And originally, we had tried to be kind of a little avant-garde with our approach, and we had a character that we actually had taken some license with, and it was really sort of his mind, his inner voice telling the story, because we had him as a deaf mute. And this was Dr. Nunez's assistant, who was a black African of mixed descent. We believed that he could very well have been Jewish, from a coastal community that actually was Jewish, and as black Africans. So we weren't sure by taking this license if we were doing something that was plausible for the time and the period. So we went to one of our experts, and when we told him the backstory we had developed, he said it was absolutely accurate, that it was even even beyond what we believed could be true, in the sense of mixing different African populations within the communities in Portugal and Spain. And the one thing I have to say, going back before the Inquisition, there was the Age of Enlightenment. And when Rick mentioned earlier that the language of Judaism for the Middle Ages during that Age of Enlightenment was Spanish, it was because and Spain was the center of the Age of Enlightenment, and it was a time when Christians and Muslims coexisted in peaceful harmony, until there was a time when the Moors had control of Spain. Well, the Spaniards and the Christians wanted to, shift the power, and eventually they did. They overtook the Muslim population and in conflict, and after that period of time was when Isabel and Ferdinand came into power, and that's when and it's there was probably equal disdain for the Catholics, for the Christian Catholics, toward the Muslims as they had toward the Jews. So some of the Inquisition involved the Muslims, and they paid the same kind of price, that they either had to flee or convert and so forth. So jumping forward in time, an important part of the story is, okay, we have Dr. Nunez is called by these three very powerful, very important, very wealthy businessmen who were at one time refugees of sorts from the Iberian Peninsula themselves, with some exceptions. There were three gentlemen. One came from Amsterdam, and the other two at one time were refugees themselves from Portugal. One was the head of the East Indian Trading Company, and one was head of the Bank of England, and the gentleman from Amsterdam basically was kind of royalty in his own right, and very much a land baron in Amsterdam, very, very wealthy. And when there's a lot to the story about James Oglethorpe and Lord Egmont, who is also known as John Percival, who was also a noble in London. Oglethorpe encountered a situation where a friend of his was imprisoned in a debtor's prison. Supposedly he was thrown in prison because he couldn't pay a £5 note. And he died a horrible death in prison because he was, thrown into a cell with other prisoners with smallpox, and, he ended up dying. And Oglethorpe basically led the charge in the English Parliament to reform the imprisonment system, the
Debtor prisons.
Yes, the debtor prisons, and he got John Percival involved, and this kind of morphed at one point in time to the idea of establishing a colony of Georgia. And the reason they wanted to, lead the charge for having this colony was, one, as a military outpost to create a buffer between Florida, where the Spanish had overtaken, several communities and were headquartered in St. Augustine, Florida, just south of the Georgia-Florida line. But of course it didn't really exist then. It was kind of a virtual border. And the English colony of South Carolina. And there was this land in between, and the land was, the only people who really seemingly had a stake in the land were the natives, were the Native Americans that were living and thriving within what became Georgia. And they sort of pandered to the king's ego a little bit and suggested that they call the colony Georgia. They create a military outpost, and not just debtors. There was kind of like misinformation about Georgia becoming a colony of debtors that were freed from prison, and that's all it was. Well, they realized early on that they couldn't create a community that would thrive if they were just a group of people that were impoverished, people that, some of them were probably drunks and they weren't well off. They had gambling problems. They just couldn't function well in society, so they tossed them in prison. Well, you can't build a community if you don't have people with skills, carpenters and people with foresight and merchants and tradesmen and so forth. So the English, they formed a trusteeship of 21 trustees, which included Oglethorpe and Percival and 19 other, mostly noblemen, appointed by the king. And these three businessmen at Beavis Marks Synagogue kind of got word that this was all going on, because it was in the newspapers, and it was, word on the street was that this new colony was going to be established, and they were soliciting for, volunteers and people, particularly people with skills, to go over and establish the new colony. Well, in the process of all this, they knew about these three very wealthy, very powerful businessmen. So they gave them commissions to help them find individuals to send to the colony.
Also to raise money, Mark.
Yeah, well, and to raise money, yeah, to finance the operation. So they got to thinking, the three businessmen, and they got to thinking, well, why don't we just send our own? So that's what they planned on doing, and of course the trustees got wind of the fact that they weren't really looking too hard to find people outside their own Jewish community, and that's not what they wanted. They didn't want a Jewish colony. It wasn't good for the image, and there was still a lot of prejudice and antisemitism. So they revoked their commissions, and they had paid them some money, and they wanted their money back. Of course, they never got their money back. And then they decided on their own, the three mahars of the synagogue, to send 42 of their own. They could hire a ship. They had the means to hire a ship, and a crew, and send them to the colony anyways. And hopefully they would be assimilated, when they got there. They figured that it was unlikely they'd turn them back. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. Now, in getting back to the history,
Hey,
I'm
Mark.
sorry, go ahead.
Not sorry to cut you off. I just want to make sure we have enough time to get some
Sure.
audience questions answered.
All right.
And the first one is from Michael Klein, and he asks, why did the authorities release Dr. Nunez from the Inquisition in 1705? So the first time.
Because he confessed to Judaizing. So after being tortured, he confessed. His wife, though, Gracia, was not so quick to confess, and she was kept. They had to really add additional ropes. So she was somebody who had I think probably a stronger constitution than he had, and he finally convinced her to confess and get it over with. But it wasn't without them confessing to their sins. Yeah.
And thank you. And then we have another one from Gloria Simon. Was the Flames of Freedom research made into a documentary or just a podcast? If both, can we see and or hear these?
Absolutely. So the podcast, if you go, I think, are you going to put, Lizzie, are you going to put the information? If you go to flamesoffreedom.net, you can listen to the podcast there. We also have the revealed episodes, which are the interviews with, I think we have 5 historians that we interviewed. So all of that's available, or you can get it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So all the information's there. So it's not been made into a documentary. There's the docudrama, and then there's these historical interviews.
As a podcast only.
As a podcast only, and we're still in the process of trying to sell this as a series for something like a Netflix. or HBO. A little harder job in terms of raising money. So you can create a podcast for a penny on the dollar from what it costs to produce it as a film. So if any of you have $50 million, we'd like to be talking to you about investing in the film project.
That would be wonderful. We would love to see that. And we have another question from Richard Marks. What's next for Flames of Freedom? It's such a cliffhanger at the end. That's a great question. I have that as well.
You want to take that one, Mark?
Okay, well, one thing we're in the process of right now is that we really have enough from a podcast standpoint. We feel we could easily carry the podcast another, into a second and even a third, even possibly a fourth season if we have the means to do it. So in the meantime, we've written one kind of long episode as the first installment of season 2. And all the while we're doing some searching for some sponsorship money. Actually, we had tried to monetize it from conventional podcast standpoint by integrating some commercials, but the gentleman who was financing the project, thought the commercials were very disruptive, which commercials are disruptive, whether it's on TV or otherwise. But in some cases a necessary evil, even though I made my living making commercials for many years. It's still part of the process, and so we do have the intent to carry on the podcast at least another season or at least a few more episodes. The episode that we're engaging right now is, I don't want to give away, well, everybody kind of knows what happens because Georgia was developed, Savannah became the center of the colony of Georgia, and eventually the revolution came along and control shifted from the British to an American colony where it eventually became a state. Interestingly enough, the original settlers, there were 42 Jews that left London and 41 that arrived. There was an infant, which if you've listened to the podcast, one of the families, the in-laws of the doctor, the in-laws from the sister-in-law and brother-in-law had a child, a baby, and the baby died on the voyage, didn't survive the voyage. So 41 actually landed in the colony, and and it was such a shock. Here was a very raw foreign soil. They had language issues. Some spoke a little bit of English. The Ashkenazis, most of them spoke German, maybe a little Yiddish, maybe a hair of English from living in London or in England. And there was an element of a little bit of a schism between the Ashkenazis and the Sephardics, because culturally and religiously they were very different. They were separated by language, German versus Portuguese. Maybe English was somewhat of a common language. The Ashkenazis were more religious from the standpoint of knowing more about Jewish tradition from a rabbinical Judaism standpoint, and more stringent with following the kosher laws and abiding by some of the stricter mandates, where the Sephardics were a lot looser and knew less about it, didn't know much Hebrew, and culturally were different. And in fact, the Ashkenazis who spoke German actually bonded very well with what was the group of Germans that ended up
Salzburgers.
The Salzburgers also came from Germany, or what became Germany. So they helped them settle. and Benjamin Sheftel and some of the other Ashkenazis, played integral roles in the establishment of the colony and becoming merchants and supporting the revolution, and became very successful.
Yeah. One of the great ironies is that in early 1741, the Spanish attacked St. Simon's Island with the intention of wiping out the new colony. And knowing that the Spanish were coming, all the Sephardic Jews decided they didn't want to be around when they arrived for fear of being arrested and actually deported back to Spain to be tried. And so most of the Sephardic Jews departed for Charleston or even north to New York or Philadelphia. And so the irony is that and one of the great ironies in this, just historically, is that many of the Nunez next generations converted back to Christianity, ironically. So anyway, we're hoping the first episode will hopefully go into production in the next few weeks on that, and that'll be out hopefully sometime probably by June or so, I think. And yeah, so that's what they can expect.
Amazing. I'm gonna pop back on. And I want to thank everybody for being here. And Michael, Mark, and Richard, thank you so much for this conversation. Mark and Richard, your podcast along with the team is fascinating, and it's such an important way to bring this story to light, to make these historic characters more than just characters. They're people, they're not historical figures, they're characters, and I just so appreciate that. If you all haven't listened to Flames of Freedom, I'm kind of jealous because now you get to enjoy it for the first time. And you can find that on flamesoffreedom.net and be ready for their next for when they're in Georgia and them stepping ashore. I want to shout out a few more of our programs happening at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in a little over a month. Both in person and online, we are welcoming Dr. Sherry Rabin to talk about her new book, The Jewish South in American History, which allows readers to see the South through the eyes of people with a distinct religious heritage, and talks about Southern history as something older than the U.S. itself, tying back into this podcast. And that will be Thursday, May 22nd at 6 Central at the museum, and you can also join us virtually. But that one will not be recorded, so please join us virtually when you can. Please also stay up to date with all the things that are happening at the museum via our newsletters. The best way to keep in touch with us is to become a member. Support the museum. You get an extra newsletter every month that tells you all the things that are happening, some really interesting history. So we hope that you can join us, support us, and become a member. I'm popping the book talk into the chat, as well as where you can find out more information on how to support us. If you have any questions, please let me know. And we just appreciate Mark and Richard for your time and also for making this wonderful podcast. I hope everybody has a great rest of their evening.
Thanks for having us.
All right, we appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening and for allowing us to ramble on. If you have further questions for Rick and I about the podcast or the story, there is a contact method on our website.
Yeah. And everybody will get a follow-up email with this information as well. So you can click the links here, or you can click the links in your follow-up email. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your night.
All right. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.